The morning of 24 April, 1794, northeastern France, near the village of Villers-en-Cauchies, the ground trembles. Not from artillery, there hasn't been time to deploy the guns. The tremor comes from hooves, 10,000 hooves to be precise, belonging to French cavalry bearing, down on a British position that shouldn't exist, defended by men who should be dead already. Lieutenant Colonel John Ayrey of the 15th Light Dragoons steadies his horse and watches the horizon darken. French chasseurs and hussars pour across the muddy fields in a living wall of sabres and fury. Behind them, denser formations. Cuirassiers in their breastplates, carabiniers with their distinctive helmets, catching the weak spring sunlight. Between 6,000 and 7,000 cavalry. The largest massed cavalry charge witnessed in the war thus far. Ayrey commands fewer than 500 dragoons. His Austrian allies, who were supposed to support this position, have already withdrawn, leaving British cavalry exposed on ground they cannot possibly hold. The mud is axle deep. Infantry support is nowhere near. Escape routes are cut off. By every tactical calculation, by every principle in the drill manuals, these men should wheel about and flee. Instead, Ayrey gives an order that defies military logic. The regiment will advance, 470 sabres against 7,000, in mud, unsupported, against revolutionary France's finest cavalry. What happens next will be studied in military academies for generations, and then, inexplicably, it will be forgotten, buried beneath the greater glories of Waterloo and the Peninsular campaigns, overshadowed by more famous names and more politically convenient victories. The Battle of Villers-en-Cauchies will become a footnote, remembered by regimental historians and virtually no one else. This is the story of the British cavalry's finest hour in the French Revolutionary Wars, a victory so complete, so tactically brilliant, and so utterly improbable that even those who fought in it struggled to explain their survival. It's the story of why 500 men chose to charge 7,000, and why that suicidal decision proved to be the only thing that could save them. More than that, it's a study in the art of shock action, in leadership under impossible circumstances, and in how tactical genius can be buried under the weight of historical amnesia. Because whilst Britain remembers its great cavalry charges, Balaclava's doomed heroism, Waterloo's decisive impact, Villers-en-Cauchies, has slipped from our collective memory despite being, by objective, military analysis, the most successful cavalry action of the entire Revolutionary and Napoleonic period. The Battle of Villers-en-Cauchies lasted less than an hour. In that hour, a small force of British and Allied cavalry defeated a vastly superior enemy, captured colors, scattered entire brigades, and achieved casualty ratios that seem impossible even by the generous standards of after-action reports. They did it through a combination of perfect timing, aggressive tactics, and sheer audacity. And then history forgot them. To understand how 500 men could defeat 7,000, we must first understand the weapon they wielded, not the saber, but the institution that shaped them. The 15th Light Dragoons had been raised in 1759 during the 7 Years' War, part of the great expansion of British cavalry that recognized the growing importance of mounted troops in European warfare. Unlike the heavy cavalry, the regiments of horse guards and dragoon guards, with their towering troopers on massive chargers, the Light Dragoons were conceived as a mobile force, scouts, skirmishers, and pursuers. They rode smaller horses, carried lighter equipment, and trained for speed and maneuverability, rather than the shock of massed impact. By 1794, the 15th had evolved into one of the British Army's most professional mounted units. The regiment had served in Ireland during the American Revolutionary War years, a posting that sounds mundane, but provided exactly the kind of experience that would prove crucial: patrolling. independent command at junior officer level, and rapid response to developing situations. Whilst some regiments rusted in garrison, the 15th maintained a culture of active service. Lieutenant Colonel John Ayrey had assumed command in 1793, just as Britain entered the war against revolutionary France. Ayrey remains frustratingly obscure. No portrait survives. His personal papers have vanished, and his background must be reconstructed from scattered regimental records and army lists. We know he was the younger son of a Yorkshire family, that he had purchased his way through the ranks in the typical fashion of the 18th century officer corps, and that he was in his early 30s when he led the 15th into Flanders. What distinguished Ayrey was not aristocratic connection. He had none of note but professional competence. Contemporary accounts describe him as methodical in drill, strict but fair in discipline, and notably attentive to the condition of his horses. In an army where many officers regarded their regiments as income-producing sinecures, Ayrey actually trained his men. The 15th deployed to Flanders in 1793 as part of the Duke of York's army, Britain's contribution to the First Coalition against revolutionary France. The strategic situation was fluid and increasingly desperate. France, having executed its king and abolished the monarchy, faced a coalition of Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and various German states. Yet revolutionary fervor and the levée en mass conscription of the French nation were producing armies of unprecedented size. The professional armies of the Ancien Régime found themselves outnumbered by ideologically motivated forces that accepted casualties the old order considered unthinkable. The Austrian Netherlands, modern Belgium, became a primary theater of operations. Here, on terrain that would later be soaked in the blood of two world wars, the armies of the First Coalition attempted to contain and reverse French expansion. The operational environment was challenging. A landscape of low ridges, small villages, and fields turned to quagmire by spring rains. Roads were few and poor. Supply lines stretched back to the Channel ports. Intelligence was fragmentary. British cavalry in this theater operated under significant constraints. The Duke of York, whatever his limitations as a field commander, understood cavalry tactics well enough to use his mounted troops for reconnaissance and flank security. But British cavalry doctrine in 1794 remained influenced by continental practices, specifically the Prussian model that emphasized controlled movements and reformation after charges. British troopers were trained to charge, retire, and reorganize before engaging. Again, the French Revolutionary Cavalry operated under different principles. Republican enthusiasm and desperate circumstances produced a more aggressive doctrine. Rapid mass charges, with less emphasis on maintaining formation. Quality varied enormously. Some units consisted of veterans from the Royal Army who had embraced the revolution, whilst others were barely trained recruits mounted on requisitioned farm horses. But they compensated for inconsistent quality with numbers and aggression. Through the winter of 1793 and into the spring of 1794, Ayrey's 15th Light Dragoons gained combat experience in the miserable circumstances of the Flanders campaign. Skirmishes in fog, patrol clashes on muddy roads, escort duties for supply columns, the unglamorous work that provided tactical education. The regiment learned ground sense, how to read terrain, where cavalry could operate effectively, where mud and ditches negated mounted advantages. They also learned a crucial lesson about their Austrian allies. The Habsburg forces were professional and experienced, but they were fighting a defensive war to preserve dynastic territory, not an existential struggle for survival. When situations deteriorated, Austrian commanders often chose preservation over sacrifice. British cavalry, operating alongside Austrian units, could not always rely on support when circumstances turned dire. By April, 1794, the situation had worsened considerably. French forces under General Charles Pichegru were pushing into the Austrian Netherlands with increasing success. The coalition struggled to coordinate operations amongst allies, with competing objectives and different operational styles. The Duke of York's British contingent found itself frequently detached, operating in cooperation with Austrian forces but not under fully integrated command. It was in these circumstances that Lieutenant Colonel Ayrey received orders to take position near the village of Villers-en-Cauchies on 23 April. The mission appeared straightforward: provide flank security for Austrian forces operating in the area and screen against French cavalry probes. Austrian cavalry would support the position. Infantry were nearby if needed. Ayrey led 4 squadrons of the 15th Light Dragoons, approximately 360 sabres, supplemented by a small detachment of Austrian horse and a company of the 3rd Foot Guards who had been attached as support. In total, perhaps 500 British and Allied troops. They took position on low ridges near Villers-en-Cauchies, established pickets, and settled in for what should have been a routine deployment. The ground, however, told a different story to anyone who read it carefully. The fields around Villers-en-Cauchies were clay-rich and waterlogged from spring rains. Wheeled traffic could barely move. Infantry would struggle in the mud. For cavalry, the conditions were treacherous. Horses could lose their footing, speed was compromised, and maneuver became difficult. Yet the same mud that constrained movement also created opportunity. A commander who understood the ground could use it, could turn constraint into advantage if he possessed the skill and nerve. Ayrey studied the terrain as the light faded on 23 April. He positioned his squadrons on the slight elevations where drainage was marginally better. He noted the approaches and the dead ground. He checked on his horses personally, ensuring they were properly fed and shod. His officers received clear instructions about picket rotations and alarm procedures. And then he waited for the morning he must have known would bring crisis. French forces were active in the area. Intelligence reports suggested significant cavalry movement. The tactical situation was deteriorating. Lieutenant Colonel John Ayrey had spent his career preparing for a moment he could not fully anticipate. That moment would arrive with dawn on 24 April 1794. Morning reconnaissance on 24 April revealed the nightmare scenario. French cavalry had moved during the night in far greater strength than intelligence predicted. As visibility improved in the gray dawn, Ayrey's pickets reported alarming sightings. Chasseurs, in company strength, probing the rebellion the gray. Perimeter, hussars in squadron formations maneuvering on the flanks, and behind them most ominously dense formations of heavy cavalry massing for a coordinated assault. The strategic picture became clear, quickly and disastrously. A major French cavalry force under General François Etienne, Kellerman, son of the hero of Valmy, had moved to envelope the Allied position. Kellerman commanded between 6,000 and 7,000 cavalry, approximately 12 regiments drawn from across the French revolutionary armies. The force included light cavalry for speed and harassment, supplemented by cuirassiers and carabiniers for shock action. It represented one of the largest concentrations of French mounted troops assembled thus far in the war. Against this force, Ayrey commanded his 4 squadrons of the 15th Light Dragoons, plus perhaps 100 Austrian cavalry, approximately 470 sabres total. The Guards' infantry, whilst superb troops, numbered barely 100 men and would be almost useless in mobile operations across muddy fields. The Austrian cavalry commander assessed the situation with professional clarity. The position was untenable. His forces withdrew before the French assault developed, falling back to more defensible terrain. This was tactically sound by conventional calculation, It also left the 15th Light Dragoons completely isolated. Ayrey faced a decision that would define his career and his regiment's legacy. Military. Orthodoxy offered clear guidance. Withdraw immediately. Preserve the force. Fall back to friendly lines. The 15th could not possibly hold against odds of 15-1. Any stand would be annihilation. Yet withdrawal presented its own problems. The mud that constrained movement would slow a Danfriend, retreat disastrously. French cavalry could pursue and cut down fleeing troops, unable to maintain formation in the clinging clay. The Guards' infantry would be abandoned. They could not possibly keep pace with mounted troops, and withdrawal would expose the flank of other Allied formations, potentially precipitating a broader collapse. Ayrey made a calculation that still astonishes military historians. The only way to survive was to attack. The tactical logic, reconstructed from the after-action reports and the ground itself, reveals Ayrey's thinking. French cavalry advancing across muddy fields would be constrained, formations compressed, units intermixed as they navigated the treacherous footing. They would expect British cavalry to flee or defend statically. An aggressive countercharge, properly timed, could strike French formations before they had fully deployed, could hit them whilst they were still in approach march rather than battle formation. Moreover, shock had value beyond simple physics. Cavalry combat was as much psychological as mechanical. Troops, expecting to pursue fleeing enemy suddenly confronted with aggressive attack, could lose cohesion, especially in difficult terrain where reformation was challenging. Surprise could multiply force. Ayrey issued his orders with clarity that admitted no debate. The 15th would form line and advance to contact. They would charge home, no retirement, no reformation, but sustained, aggressive action until the enemy broke or the 15th was destroyed. The Guards would form square and hold the ridge, providing a rallying point if the cavalry action failed catastrophically. The Light Dragoons formed line with the precision of parade ground drill. 4 squadrons, approximately 90 to 100 men each, formed a front of perhaps 200 yards. The troopers checked their girths, loosened sabres in scabbards, and waited for the order they all knew was coming. What happened next has been documented in multiple accounts, British, Austrian, and French, all agreeing on the essential facts whilst differing on details. As French cavalry advanced in overwhelming numbers, Ayrey gave the order, walk march. The 15th moved forward at a steady pace, maintaining formation despite the mud pulling at hooves. French cavalry, seeing the impossibly outnumbered British line advancing rather than fleeing, hesitated momentarily, just long enough for Ayrey to read the confusion and exploit it. Trot! The pace increased. Horses struggled in the mud but maintained alignment. The distance closed. French formations, compressed by terrain and surprised by the barter. Aggression began to lose cohesion. Junior officers looked for orders. Troopers wondered whether to charge or receive the charge. Gallop! Charge! The 15th Light Dragoons accelerated into the mass of French cavalry with the concentrated fury of a battering ram striking a door. The impact was devastating. The key to understanding what followed is recognizing that cavalry combat at this scale was not a single collision, but a rolling melee, multiple individual and small unit actions across a fluid battlefield. The 15th struck the French leading elements with the advantage of momentum and cohesion. British troopers, trained to high standards of horsemanship and sabre drill, engaged French cavalry, who were still trying to deploy from approach formation. The initial impact scattered French advanced units. But rather than retiring to reform standard British cavalry, practice Ayrey's squadrons drove deeper into the French mass. This violated conventional doctrine but proved tactically brilliant. French cavalry behind the disrupted leading units could not effectively engage because their own disorganized comrades blocked approach. The 15th fought, at close quarters where British discipline and training provided maximum advantage. Contemporary accounts describe the action in vivid detail. Sergeant Major Charles Ewart of the 15th, in a letter preserved in regimental archives, wrote, "We carved through them like foresters through brambles. Their front ranks tried to stand, but we were amongst them before they could properly form, and those behind could scarce reach us for their own men in the way." French cavalry attempted to envelope the smaller British force, using numerical superiority to attack flanks and rear, but the mud that had initially seemed such a disadvantage now worked in British favor. French units maneuvering for position became mired in the deepest clay. Horses lost footing. Formations that tried to wheel or turn found themselves struggling just to maintain movement. The 15th, concentrated and committed to forward momentum, carved a series of lanes through the French mass. Individual squadrons became separated but continued aggressive action independently. What should have been a death trap, deep penetration into overwhelming enemy numbers, became a tactical advantage because French cavalry could not coordinate effective response in the churning chaos of mud and melee. The crisis point came perhaps 20 minutes into the engagement. French commanders, recovering from initial surprise, began organizing concentrated counterattacks. Heavy cavalry cuirassiers, with their armored breastplates, moved to smash the British formations. If these units struck home with their superior weight and protection, the 15th would be crushed. Ayrey, somehow maintaining command presence in the chaos, identified the threat, rather than attempting to disengage impossible in the tide. Circumstances, he led a squadron directly at the approaching cuirassiers. The action defied every tactical principle. Light Dragoons in frontal assault against heavy cavalry would normally be suicidal, but Ayrey chose his moment with perfect precision. The cuirassiers were advancing upslope, across the worst mud, in tight formation that compromised individual maneuverability. The 15th struck them just as the leading ranks struggled through a particularly waterlogged section of field. Momentum carried British cavalry into and through the heavy cavalry formation before French weight could be brought to bear. The psychological impact shattered French cohesion. If armored cuirassiers could not break the British line, what could? French units began to pull back, seeking to reorganize. But withdrawal in the mud proved as difficult as advance. What began as tactical retirement became confused retreat as units intermixed and command control fragmented. The 15th pursued with relentless aggression. They captured the standard of the 8th Chasseurs à Cheval, a color that represented unit honor and had been carried through multiple campaigns. They captured a second color from the 5th Dragoons. They sabred French officers attempting to rally their men, and they drove the mass of French cavalry from the field in a route that continued for over 2 miles. The action lasted approximately 50 minutes, from first contact to French withdrawal. When it ended, the battlefield presented a scene of devastation, difficult to reconcile with the forces involved. British casualties were remarkably light. 3 officers wounded, none mortally, and 39 other ranks killed or wounded. Given the scale of action and the odds, these figures seem almost impossible. French casualties were catastrophic. Conservative estimates placed French losses at over 500 killed, wounded, or captured. Some French accounts admit to 800 casualties. Scattered equipment, abandoned horses, and the bodies of fallen troopers littered the muddy fields. For miles, 2 captured colors, tangible proof of French defeat, hung from British saddles as the 15th reorganized. The Guards, who had watched the action from their square with growing astonishment, emerged to secure prisoners and gather wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Ayrey, splattered with mud and blood, assessed his regiment. Horses were blown and exhausted. Men were physically and emotionally drained. But the 15th Light Dragoons had just achieved what would come to be regarded as the most one-sided cavalry victory of the entire Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. General Kellerman, the French commander, filed a report that attempted to explain the inexplicable. He blamed the mud, the confusion, the scattered nature of his forces. French cavalry, he insisted, had fought bravely, but circumstances had conspired against success. The report said nothing about being routed by a walk, force 1/15 his strength. For the British, the immediate military consequences were significant. The French cavalry threat in this sector had been neutralized. Allied forces gained crucial time to reorganize. The flank that the 15th had been positioned to protect remained secure, and British morale received an enormous boost, proof that revolutionary France's vaunted cavalry could be beaten decisively. The Duke of York, in his dispatch to London, praised the action in terms that suggested even he found it difficult to believe. Lieutenant Colonel Ayrey and the 15th Light Dragoons have gained a victory so complete and so remarkable in the circumstances of its achievement that it must rank amongst the most distinguished actions of the war. Parliament voted an address of thanks. The captured colors were deposited with due ceremony. Ayrey received promotion to full colonel. The 15th Light Dragoons gained battle honors that would be embroidered on their colors and guidons for the next century. And then, slowly but inexorably, the memory began to fade. In the immediate aftermath of Villers-en-Cauchies, the victory seemed destined for lasting glory. The captured French colors were paraded through London before being laid up in Westminster Abbey, where they hung alongside other trophies of British arms. Contemporary newspapers celebrated the action with detailed accounts. The Gentleman's Magazine devoted 4 pages to the battle, including a tactical diagram and biographical sketches of the officers involved. Prints depicting the charge sold briskly in London shops. For several months, Villers-en-Cauchies represented British success. In an otherwise frustrating war, Colonel John Ayrey returned to active duty, with his enhanced reputation intact. The 15th Light Dragoons continued service in Flanders through the remainder of 1794, though they never again encountered an opportunity matching the drama of that April morning. When the British Army withdrew from the continent in 1795, the Flanders campaign having ultimately failed in its strategic objectives, the 15th returned to England, having lost the war but won its most famous battle. Ayrey's subsequent career followed the pattern, typical of successful regimental officers without political connections. He commanded the 15th through various postings, maintained the regiment at high standards of discipline and training, and retired on half pay in 1803. He married, produced children who entered unremarkable careers, and died in 1826 at his modest estate in Yorkshire. No biography was written. His papers, if they ever existed in substantial form, have not survived in accessible archives. The 15th Light Dragoons continued as a distinguished regiment. They served in the Peninsular War and at Waterloo, where they performed creditably, if not spectacularly. The regiment maintained pride in Villers-en-Cauchies. The captured colors remained treasured relics, and 24 April was observed as a regimental celebration day. But as the 19th century progressed and the Napoleonic Wars produced their catalogue of more famous engagements, Villers-en-Cauchies gradually receded from public consciousness. Several factors contributed to this historical amnesia. First, the battle occurred early in the French Revolutionary Wars, before the great campaigns that would define the period in popular memory. Waterloo, with its decisive strategic importance and dramatic narrative, naturally overshadowed earlier actions. The Peninsular War, lasting 6 years and involving far larger British forces, generated its own mythology of heroism. Villers-en-Cauchies became a prologue, rather than a climactic episode, a footnote to the real story. Second, the strategic context worked against lasting memory. The Flanders Campaign of 1793 to 1795 was ultimately a failure. Britain withdrew. The French consolidated control of the Low Countries, and the First Coalition collapsed. Tactical victories like Villers-en-Cauchies could not compensate for strategic defeat. British military historiography tended to emphasize successful campaigns, Portugal, Spain, the final triumph of Waterloo, rather than dwell on the failures of the 1790s. Third, the very nature of the victory made it difficult to incorporate into broader narratives of British military excellence. The action succeeded precisely because it violated tactical orthodoxy. Ayrey's decision to charge rather than withdraw, to sustain the attack rather than reform, contradicted the principles taught at military academies. Celebrating Villers-en-Cauchies meant acknowledging that desperate audacity sometimes trumped tactical doctrine, an uncomfortable lesson for military institutions invested in systematic training. Fourth, neither Ayrey nor the 15th Light Dragoons possessed the social and political capital necessary to maintain their place in public memory. Ayrey was not an aristocrat, not a member of parliament, not a figure who moved in circles where memoirs were written and histories commissioned. The 15th, whilst a fine regiment, lacked the social prestige of the household cavalry or the historical mystique of more senior regiments. Without powerful advocates to preserve their story, Villers-en-Cauchies gradually faded from histories that focused on more famous commanders and socially prominent units. Yet the battle's influence persisted in less obvious ways. British cavalry doctrine in the early 19th century underwent significant evolution, moving towards more aggressive shock tactics. Whilst multiple factors drove this change, the example of Villers-en-Cauchies provided proof that audacious attack could succeed against superior numbers. The lesson was not that cavalry should always charge, regardless of odds that way led to Balaclava, but that aggressive action, properly timed against confused or unprepared enemy, could achieve results far beyond what defensive tactics might accomplish. Military theorists studying cavalry operations examined Villers-en-Cauchies as a case study in exploiting temporary advantages. The battle demonstrated how terrain that constrained both sides could benefit the force that maintained cohesion and momentum. It showed the importance of aggressive leadership that refused to accept apparent impossibility, and it illustrated how psychological shock, the sheer surprise of outnumbered forces attacking rather than fleeing, could multiply effective combat power. The Prussian military historian Georg Venturini, writing in 1814, included detailed analysis of Villers-en-Cauchies in his multi-volume study of cavalry tactics. He identified the action as exemplifying principles of Schwerpunkt concentration of force at the decisive point and aggressive exploitation of enemy disorder. Venturini's work influenced Prussian cavalry doctrine, and through Prussia's military influence, affected broader European tactical thought. Captain Louis Nolan, the British cavalry officer whose tactical writings shaped mid-19th century mounted doctrine, referenced Villers-en-Cauchies in his 1851 work, Cavalry, Its History and Tactics. Nolan held up the battle as evidence that British cavalry, properly led and aggressively employed, could achieve remarkable results. Ironically, Nolan himself would die at Balaclava, in a charge that represented aggressive cavalry action without the careful timing that made Villers-en-Cauchies successful. Modern military analysis has rediscovered Villers-en-Cauchies as a case study in several contexts. Defense scholars studying operations in restrictive terrain, mud, urban environments, constrained approach routes, examine how the 15th Light Dragoons turned environmental constraints into tactical advantages. The battle illustrates principles applicable beyond cavalry actions. how limitations affecting all parties can be exploited by forces that adapt doctrine to circumstances. Leadership studies cite Ayrey's decision-making under extreme pressure as an example of rapid assessment and decisive action when conventional options were unavailable. His choice to attack rather than withdraw demonstrates the kind of initiative and tactical creativity that military institutions theoretically value but often struggle to cultivate. Historians of the British Army's professional development note that Villers-en-Cauchies occurred during a transitional period when purchased commissions still predominated, but professional competence was increasingly valued. Ayrey represented an emerging type, the officer who advanced not primarily through connections, but through demonstrated ability to train troops and command in action. His obscurity in broader historical memory paradoxically highlights the social barriers that even successful professional officers faced in an army still dominated by aristocratic privilege. The battle also serves as a reminder of how military history gets written and remembered. Spectacular failures like the charge of the Light Brigade become cultural touchstones, whilst equally dramatic but more successful actions fade from memory. Strategic defeats containing tactical victories are forgotten in favor of campaigns that produced ultimate triumph, and individuals without social prominence or literary advocates disappear from historical consciousness regardless of their achievements. In 1892, the 15th Hussars, as the 15th Light Dragoons had been, redesignated, commissioned a regimental history. The chapter on Villers-en-Cauchies ran to 30 pages, reconstructed from surviving documents, pension applications from elderly veterans, and French archival sources. The author, a retired officer of the regiment, concluded, "It may be questioned whether any body of British cavalry ever achieved so complete a victory against such overwhelming odds in so short a time." Yet, even this detailed regimental history remained largely unknown outside military circles. It was not reprinted, not excerpted in popular histories, not taught in schools. Villers-en-Cauchies remained what it had become, a regimental memory, treasured by those who served in the 15th, but unknown to the broader public that remembered Waterloo, Balaclava, and the great cavalry charges of imperial campaigns. The 20th century brought 2 world wars that transformed cavalry from battlefield reality to ceremonial anachronism. Horses gave way to tanks, sabres to machine guns. The context that made Villers-en-Cauchies comprehensible: the supremacy of cavalry in mobile warfare, the importance of morale and shock action, became historically remote. Modern audiences, unfamiliar with the mechanics of mounted combat, found cavalry actions generally difficult to visualize and appreciate. The 15th, 19th King's Royal Hussars formed from the merger of the 15th and 19th. Hussars in 1922 continued to commemorate Villers-en-Cauchies internally. But even within the regiment, the battle's details became hazy as living memory faded and institutional focus shifted to 20th century campaigns. When the regiment amalgamated further into the Light Dragoons in 1992, Villers-en-Cauchies became one battle honor amongst dozens, its unique significance diluted by time and the sheer accumulation of subsequent service. Colonel John Ayrey lived to the age of 64, dying peacefully in 1826 at his Yorkshire home. He was buried in the local parish churchyard, where his gravestone, still legible today, makes no mention of Villers-en-Cauchies. The inscription records only his service to the crown and his devotion to family. His descendants followed unremarkable paths: a son who became a country solicitor, a daughter who married a clergyman, grandchildren who dispersed into the Victorian middle class. The captured French colors remained in Westminster Abbey until 1829, when they were returned to the regiment for safekeeping. They survived until 1940, when they were destroyed during the Blitz victims of German bombing that cared nothing for the military glories of a century and a half earlier. Photographs exist showing faded silk and embroidered eagles, but the physical evidence of Britain's most remarkable cavalry victory vanished in a night of fire over London. The battlefield at Villers-en-Cauchies is today agricultural land, looking much as it did in 1794. Clay fields still turn to quagmire after rain. The low ridges remain, though modern farm buildings occupy the ground where the guards formed square. A small monument, erected by the Commune in 1994 for the battle's bicentenary, stands alongside the D643 road. Few visitors stop. The site lacks the emotional resonance of Waterloo or the well-developed interpretation of major battlefield parks. Yet military historians who study cavalry operations still examine Villers-en-Cauchies with professional interest. In 1996, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst conducted a staff ride to the battlefield, walking the ground and reconstructing the tactical decisions. Participating officers accustomed to mechanized warfare found the lessons surprisingly applicable. How to exploit enemy confusion, when to violate doctrine for tactical advantage, how leadership under pressure multiplies combat effectiveness. Dr. Stephen Brumwell, in his 2006 study Redcoats, The British Soldier and War in the Americas, notes that Villers-en-Cauchies exemplifies the professionalism of Georgian military institutions at their best: careful training, competent leadership, and tactical flexibility producing results that transcended mere numerical comparison. Brumwell argues that British military success in the 18th and 19th centuries rested not on inherent superiority, but on institutional competence that occasionally produced officers like Ayrey, professional, thoughtful, and capable of rapid decision-making under extreme pressure. The battle raises profound questions about how we remember military history and why certain actions endure in cultural memory whilst others fade. Villers-en-Cauchies succeeded completely. It achieved its tactical objective, inflicted disproportionate casualties, and demonstrated British cavalry effectiveness. Yet it has been eclipsed by more famous actions that succeeded less thoroughly or failed spectacularly. We remember Balaclava's doomed charge, but forget Villers-en-Cauchies' triumph. We celebrate Waterloo whilst overlooking the Flanders campaign that preceded it by 2 decades. Perhaps the paradox reflects something fundamental about military glory and national memory: decisive victories that resolve great questions. Waterloo ending Napoleon's career, Trafalgar securing naval supremacy, naturally dominate historical consciousness. Tactical brilliance in ultimately unsuccessful campaigns lacks the narrative satisfaction of triumph sealed and vindicated, and individual heroism in desperate circumstances. The Light Brigade charging Russian guns creates more emotionally powerful stories than professional competence efficiently applied. Yet there is value in recovering stories like Villers-en-Cauchies, precisely because they represent excellence without the distorting lens of ultimate strategic vindication or romantic failure. The 15th Light Dragoons performed superbly through training, discipline, and aggressive leadership. They won not because of superior numbers, better equipment, or favorable circumstances, but through tactical skill and audacious execution. That they won in a campaign Britain ultimately lost makes their achievement no less remarkable. Arguably, it makes it more so. The modern British Army, having long since abandoned horses for armored vehicles, nonetheless maintains institutional memory of mounted warfare's lessons. The cavalry ethos, aggressive reconnaissance, rapid exploitation of opportunity, shock action at the decisive moment translates across technological change. Officers studying at Staff College still examine cavalry actions, not to learn about horses, but to understand principles of mobile warfare, tempo, and decisive action. In that context, Villers-en-Cauchies offers lessons that transcend its specific circumstances. It demonstrates how forces can prevail against superior numbers through aggressive tactics that deny enemy advantages. It shows the importance of leadership that refuses to accept apparent impossibility when creative alternatives exist. It illustrates how training and discipline provide combat effectiveness that multiplies under pressure, and it proves that tactical victory is possible even in strategic circumstances that favor the enemy. The forgotten nature of Villers-en-Cauchies also reminds us that military institutions, for all their emphasis on tradition and regimental heritage, can be surprisingly selective in what they remember. Comfortable lessons get preserved and taught. Uncomfortable lessons, like the reality that sometimes violating doctrine works better than following it, get quietly forgotten. Victories that fit neat narratives of British martial superiority get celebrated. Victories that complicate those narratives, or that occurred in failed campaigns, fade from institutional memory. There is melancholy in contemplating Colonel Ayrey's obscurity. He commanded brilliantly in circumstances that would have destroyed lesser officers. He saved his regiment through rapid assessment and audacious execution. He achieved one of the most lopsided victories in British cavalry history, and he has been forgotten by all but specialist historians and regimental devotees. Yet perhaps that obscurity contains its own lesson. Military excellence, pursued for its own sake rather than for glory or recognition, possesses an integrity that transcends historical memory. The 15th Light Dragoons charged at Villers-en-Cauchies, not to win fame but to survive and fulfill their mission. They succeeded through professional competence rather than theatrical heroism. Their reward was survival, not statues in London squares. That seems, in the end, appropriate. Not every hero requires monuments. Not every victory needs to be remembered by nations to have mattered to those who fought and won. Colonel John Ayrey and his Light Dragoons achieved something remarkable on a muddy April morning in 1794. They knew it. Their immediate contemporaries knew it. That knowledge sustained them through subsequent years when greater glories overshadowed their achievement. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the real test of military excellence is not whether history remembers, but whether, in the moment when everything depends on decision and action, individuals and units rise to the challenge. By that measure, Lieutenant Colonel John Ayrey and the 15th Light Dragoons achieved something that no historical amnesia can diminish. They charged 7,000 with 500. They won completely. They survived to charge again. That is their legacy, forgotten or not.